Forgive me if I start with a very, very brief biblical history lesson. The story of our patriarchs and matriarchs, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Leah and Rachel, begins in chapter 12 of the book of Genesis. The Torah progresses onto the story of a people, the Hebrews or the Israelites, oppressed in Egypt in the house of slavery, escaping to freedom through the Sea of Reeds, forged in the wilderness of Sinai. And it concludes with the people of Israel standing on the threshold of the promised land. What lies between Egypt and the land of Canaan? 40 years B'MIDBAR, in the wilderness. What is the wilderness? Midbar. It's a place of great significance and importance in Judaism, but it's a place where there is no security, no safety, no settledness, no permanence, a vast place where we feel strongly our own insignificance and smallness. It's inhospitable to humans, a place where food and drink are hard to find. Jeremiah described it as a land of deserts and pits, a land of drought and darkness, a land no human had traversed, where no human being had dwelt. It's a place of hardship and wildness, the place in which a whole generation of Israelites will die, save for two people, Joshua and Caleb, but whose children will live their dream of reaching a land and home they will be able to call their own. It's the place where the Israelites will receive the Torah and become an organized people with a constitution. So the wilderness is both a place of deep trauma, as well as a place in which the children of Israel became free, independent human beings, responsible to God and themselves for their actions, a place in which they acquired wisdom and knowledge. The question of why the Torah was given in the wilderness is one that occupied the minds of our sages of old, as well as commentators and rabbis throughout the ages. Midrash Numbers Rabbah asks, why did God speak to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai? And the sages teach that the Torah was given through three things: fire, water, and wilderness. And Rabbi Igor quoted this same text in his thought for the week yesterday. Fire at the revelation on Mount Sinai, water also associated with God's revelation, and wilderness because of the opening words of our Torah portion. And God spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. The Midrash goes on to ask, and why was the Torah given through these three things? Just as fire, water, and wilderness are free to all the inhabitants of the world, so too are the words of Torah free to them. The same text also suggests that before we can acquire wisdom and Torah, we need to make ourselves kamidbar, hefker, like the wilderness, ownerless or open to all. Why was the Torah not given in the land of Israel? The answer given a little bit later on in Numbers Rabbah is that if it had been given to them in the land, the tribe in whose border it was given would have argued and said, I have a prior claim to it. For that reason, it was given in the desert, where all would have an equal claim to it. The Torah is not the exclusive property of one group. It is available to whoever chooses to acquire it and make it their own. Well, the implication from all these sources is that wisdom, Torah, the opportunity to learn from others, comes from a place of wildness, rawness, openness, from a place of humility. To acquire wisdom, we must make ourselves kamidbar, like the wilderness, stripping away all the layers we build up around ourselves. In the Talmud, a rabbi by the name of Matana, which is rather a wonderful name, and it means gift, and in fact his little peroration is a play on his name. Rav Matana offers a similar message using a phrase that appears later in the book of Numbers. Of the people's journeys, the text tells us that from the wilderness they went out to Matana, same as his name. And it goes on to say, if a person makes himself humble like this wilderness, which is open to all and upon which everyone treads, His Torah study will endure and be given to him as a gift, a matana. And if not, his Torah study will not endure. The 19th century Hasidic rabbi and leader Menachem Mendel Morgenstern of Kotsk, known as the Kotzker Rebbe, once said, "Only a person who is willing to make nothing of himself, who thinks of himself as a desert, is truly worthy of having the divine presence rest on him and of attaining the true light of the Torah." And that same message is reinforced in a rather delightful midrash that explains the choice of Sinai as the mountain for God's revelation. According to this midrash, in a wonderful flight of rabbinic imagination, the mountains of the land of Canaan run around and argue with each other that the Torah should be given on them and not on Mount Sinai, which itself remains silent. The midrash tells us that Mount Sinai was not the highest or the most splendid mountain. In fact, it's described as being the lowest of all the mountains which might have been chosen. Nonetheless, God chose Mount Sinai for the giving of the Torah in order to teach an important message, that humility is a prerequisite to the learning and receiving of Torah. And with humility, I'd also say strength and majesty, which is a very interesting combination. Well, it rather feels as if we are in a wilderness now, in many ways. The last 2.5 years have been challenging, to say the very least. And now with the ongoing invasion and devastation of Ukraine, the fuel, energy, and food crisis, the dreadful news this week about the events in Uvalde, Texas, not to mention Iraq's decision to execute any citizens communicating with Israel or Israelis, life can feel bleak at times. However, two messages of our parashah are, one, that being in the wilderness is not a permanent state, and two, that the wilderness is the place where we acquire wisdom. Both messages should give us some cause to hope. Well, I've recently been rereading some of the works of Albert Camus, whose views on the acceptance of the human condition, even in the absurdity of human existence, I found interesting, very interesting. And this was inspired by a quote attributed to Camus that a friend sent to me recently. "In the midst of hate, I found there was within me an invincible love. In the midst of tears, I found there was within me an invincible smile. In the midst of chaos, I found there was within me an invincible calm. I realized through it all that in the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer." Well, it's a wonderful quote, but in fact, just one part of it is actually by Camus, from his short essay, Return to Tipaza, which he wrote in December 1952. Going back to a beloved childhood haunt, having lived through wars and seen the worst of what humans can do to each other, he has a moment of insight in which he writes just this one line. "In the middle of winter, I at last discovered that there was in me an invincible summer." And he goes on then to describe the acceptance of life in all its beauty, over there, definitely beauty, and ugliness. And he writes, "If one forgoes a part of what is, one must forego being oneself. One must forego living or loving otherwise than by proxy. There is thus a will to live without rejecting anything of life, which is the virtue I honor most in this world. From time to time, at least, it is true that I should like to have practiced it. Inasmuch as few epochs require as much as ours that one should be equal to the best as to the worst, I should like indeed to shirk nothing and to keep faithfully a double memory. Yes, there is beauty, and there are the humiliated. Whatever may be the difficulties of the undertaking, I should like never to be unfaithful to one or to the others." Well, it seems to me that Camus is writing about the indomitable human spirit, and I felt there a connection between him and the message of our Torah portion and the book of Numbers. After years of slavery, struggle, hardship, and death in the wilderness, somehow the Israelites come out the other side, on the threshold of the promised land. In her brilliant book, Bewilderments, Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg writes of the Book of Numbers that it evokes not only geographical terrain, but also an inner landscape, an inscape, as it were, a world of imaginative being. The Midbar, the wilderness, coarse, rough, uncultivated, unordered space, is a symbol of our world, and not just the physical world. Through the Torah and its guiding hand, leading us and teaching us how to serve God and better ourselves, we are offered the chance to acknowledge and appreciate, even value the wilderness, integrating all our experiences and making of ourselves a fitting dwelling place for God. Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them, God said back in Exodus chapter 25. The tabernacle, the Mishkan, that the Israelites carry with them in the wilderness is that sanctuary, with, at its heart, the ark containing the 2 stone tablets. The word Mishkan comes from the root shachen, to dwell, from which the word Shekhinah, God's presence, comes. And so it acts as the symbol of God's indwelling presence among the Israelites. As we have seen, SHABBAT B'MIDBAR describes the special duties of the Levites, responsible for the care of the Mishkan. It describes in detail the extreme care with which the Levites must attend to the work of the tabernacle. When the Israelites pitch their tents, the Levites camp around the tabernacle and guard it, as do the Israelites also, encircling and protecting God's words written on the tablets of stone. Well, the prophet Micah sums up in just a few words the essence of the writing on the stones, what God requires of us. Only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk humbly with your God, then will your name achieve wisdom. Even when we feel we are in the wilderness, we need to try to keep the dream of the promised land flowing with milk and honey in our hearts, and keep carrying the tabernacle with us, encircling it, protecting it, and guarding it well, keeping the words of Torah close to our hearts, living fully, integrating both the darkness and the light, caring and loving each other, and doing our part to make a fitting dwelling place for God in our hearts and in our world. Amen. And really, what better way to experience the beauty of the world and the light than by welcoming to our community a young child? And today we are doubly blessed. And of course, it's the 42nd day of the Omer today. And any fans of Douglas Adams will know just how auspicious number 42 is.